Pamela Paul is the editor of the New York Times Book Review and oversees books coverage for the New York Times. She's also the host of the weekly podcast Inside the New York Times Book Review. She's the author of 5 books, and her latest is My Life with Bob, Flawed, Heroine, Keeps Book of Books, Plot Ensues. Please welcome Pamela Paul. Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Would you like to kick things off by reading a little bit from the book?
Sure. Let me ground it a little bit by saying that each chapter in this book is named after a book that I read at some point in my life and recorded in this journal that I've kept of every book I've read since I was 17. And the titles themselves were chosen kind of deliberately, not because each chapter is about the book, because I thought that would be incredibly boring to read about. This is not a work of literary criticism, but because there was something about that idea that kind of captures what I wanted to write about in that chapter, something about the way in which we read affects our lives, informs our lives, and the sort of space between reader and book. So this is from a chapter called Catch-22, and the Catch-22 is essentially, well, I'll start with it, and I'm going to read it a little bit from the middle. This is every reader's Catch-22. The more you read, the more you realize you haven't read. The more you yearn to read more, the more you understand that you have, in fact, read nothing. There is no way to finish, and perhaps that shouldn't be the goal. And I talk a little bit about how, as a child, I felt very book deprived. Some of my particular strain of want is certainly due to early deprivation. Books were, and still are, expensive, and my mother almost never purchased them. To this day, she waits for a title to become available while her name climbs up the library wait list. In my childhood bedroom, I had one meager bookshelf whose lower rung primarily accommodated back issues of Young Miss and 17 magazine. With my 10-cent second grader's allowance, that was cheap even then, ratcheted up over the years into a weekly allotment never to exceed $5, I didn't have much money for books. If I asked my mother for a book, her standard response was, get it from the library. There wasn't much you could say back to that. Our house, a creaking hulk built in 1673, had actually been our town's first library. It had long ceased to serve in that capacity, but we were just around the corner from the existing library, which was directly across from Main Street School. After dismissal, I'd cross the street and install myself for an hour or two. While the library was, of course, a public institution, it felt private to me. The children's library shelves were mine. I knew where my friends Ginny and Geneva awaited and where the slightly naughtier Clitatat gang hung out at the end of the front row. The mean kids from Deanie and Blubber looked down from the high shelf. These characters provided my social life, and I never had to be told to be quiet in their presence. I wanted to crawl into the stacks and absorb the musty smell of decades-old paper. I rifled my fingers through the wooden card catalogs like they were flip books, trying to decode them. I could be the first girl to master the Dewey Decimal System. I might one day know where every book stood. All I needed was some authority, or at least some kind of officially sanctioned status. A few years after we moved to town, I mustered the courage to ask for a job. I'm sorry, there are no jobs available for children, the librarian told me. I was 10. You wouldn't have to pay me, I insisted, my eyes gleaming with what surely came across as unhealthy fervor. That's okay, but thank you. The rejection was terrible. What was it that put the children's librarian off my candidacy? Was it the you don't have to pay me part? Did she question my intentions? Could she not see that I was a book person different from the other more casual library visitors, that I cared, that I would never leave a book face down with its spine splayed open like other kids my age? I couldn't help but feel like they were taking me down a notch. This library isn't yours, you know, is how I read it. Every once in a while, I'd gin up the pluck to inquire again, thinking maybe they wouldn't remember me from the last time. Sometimes asking at the children's library, other times going to the person at checkout with the enviable task of scanning each book through the ghostly red glow of the primitive computer system. These requests were swiftly rebuffed, and each time I felt sorry for having the temerity to ask. I'm just going to skip a little bit ahead to what to me was like the peak of my adolescence, which was that I got a job at B. Dalton. Now, this was a job. I was the only high schooler who worked there, a monumental achievement and a source of fierce pride, even if you considered there wasn't much competition. All the other employees were actual grown-ups, some of whom saw the job as a calling, others who could just as easily have been working in the produce section at the A&P. Dan, the manager, was one of the former, a short, sweaty man in his mid-30s with sparse tendrils of black hair clinging hopefully to his pate and a mind brimming with knowledge acquired the hard way. He greeted my enthusiasm and ignorance with tolerant dismissiveness. He had opinions. But I was determined to learn. I would know exactly what to read and what I would read next. My book of books would reflect this clear path forward. Here at B. Dalton, I could keep my pulse on the passions of the nation. I just had to pay attention. I quickly noticed, for example, that whenever a book broke out in a big way, someone from management ordered rising swirls of that title that spiraled majestically up from the floor. Only senior employees knew how to build and maintain these symmetrical assemblages. Regular sales clerks like me were not allowed to touch them. Massive cardboard displays, known in the trade as dumps, loomed over the aisles, where they signaled the defining cultural events of the day. Over here, pillars of Bonfire of the Vanities. Over there, an imposing tower of Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, which everyone in the weird sophisticated suburbs just had to have. I would caress this slender volume longingly, imagining that if I owned it, my true place in the universe would make itself known. I envied the people who could just stroll in and purchase a few hardcovers off the important towers with the swipe of a credit card. Somewhere along the main aisle stood a commanding dump of Dianetics. These must be important, I mused, leafing through a copy during an idle moment. What do you think you're doing? Dan barked. Just curious, I said guardedly. What is that? You don't want to know, he muttered with a quick wave of his hand. I put down the L. Ron Hubbard in a state of unquenched curiosity, too nervous to get caught going near it again. There were so many mysteries that eluded my beginner's grasp of the world of letters. What's this? I inquired, holding up one of Joseph Campbell's books on mythology. Who was Joseph Campbell, and why was he so important? What's this? I asked, pointing to a swirl of Clan of the Cave Bear with the mermaid from Splash inexplicably crawling across its cover. How did this book get to be a movie, and what did that mean? So many books indicated something significant yet inscrutable. Authors seemed to have reputations I couldn't quite deconstruct. Stuart Woods dominated an entire shelf, a monolith of contemporary letters. Anne Rule, master of criminal justice? Then the threat of crime itself came to B. Dalton. In 1989, when the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie for his novel, The Satanic Verses, my colleagues and I were swept into what felt like a mission of global import. The only time I'd given thought to Iran prior to this was during the hostage crisis, when someone graffitied "Fuck the Ayatollah" on a building near Main Street School, where it remained for the rest of my grade school education. Every time I looked at it, I thought, the world is full of mysterious danger. But this current danger was exciting. I became nearly delirious in my desire to sell the Satanic Verses, spellbound by photographs of Rushdie's daunting eyebrows and pungent gaze. The tapping of cash register buttons was swiftly upgraded into a campaign to save literature from the forces of darkness. I blazed with excitement. Each day, my coworkers and I reported for duty to get the latest instructions direct from corporate headquarters. Copies of Rushdie's book were to be kept near the cash registers. No, behind the cash registers. No, in the back of the store, the stockroom where only management could tread. Employees who did not feel safe selling the book were allowed to be taken off the schedule, no repercussions. People were bombing bookstores. Suburban customers who couldn't for their lives tell the difference between Iran and Iraq, I counted myself among them, flocked in droves to our store, whether out of curiosity, for political purposes, or simply to feel part of something. They skulked up to the cash register, saying in the hushed tones of a John le Carré character, they wanted to buy the book. If somebody asks whether we stock it or not, think carefully before you reply, we were told. Answer on a case-by-case basis. What's the book about? I asked Dan. Nobody knows, he replied.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I also worked in a bookstore in high school, and it felt like magic.
Yes, it's like the greatest privilege. But did you get a better discount? Because we only got like 5%. It was terrible.
I very rarely bought the books because what they let us do was we could borrow any hardcover we wanted as long as there were multiple copies, because they wanted us to be able to talk about the books, and that's how I read the first 5 Harry Potter books.
Oh, wow. It's a much more enlightened bookstore.
Who knows? So you allude very briefly in that reading to Bob, not by name, but can you tell us I want to say who because it's a name, but tell us about Bob.
So Bob is this journal. He's still around. He exists.
But you do use he for him.
I do.
Okay.
He's a guy. It's a really boring-looking blank book. This was like before Moleskine and like beautiful sort of bespoke journals that I started to write in when I was 17. I was living for a summer through American Field Service in France, and I was incredibly disgruntled. This I thought was going to be a very glamorous expedition, but instead I was sent to a part of France that like no one ever writes about, like a part that even French people are like, that's not France. I started to keep a journal of the books that I was reading. Previous diaries that I had kept, I found were awful. They were awful to write in, and they were awful especially to read, because what I would write in them was like, you know, angry, angsty adolescent thoughts of rejection and embarrassment and things like, Katie said she was sleeping at Wendy's house, but I asked her to sleep over first, and blah, blah. And going back and rereading those, it was like there was nothing good about them. They reflected terrible feelings. I couldn't even write well. Like there was no glimpse of any kind of literary skill in those words. And so I decided to, and also because I only wrote about the times and the things that upset me and depressed me, they didn't make for very fun reading and not enlightening either. So I decided to keep a diary of the things that I did want to remember, which was the books that I was reading. And I started off that first summer in France with The Trial by Kafka, which is what I was reading and is the name of a chapter in the book, because for me, that book was like a metaphor for adolescence, where you feel like, you know, everyone thinks that you have done something wrong, and you sort of feel innocent, and you feel like everyone's out to get you. And I've been keeping that journal ever since.
And it's still in the same.
It's still in the same book. Yes, yes. Thank you for pointing out that I've not yet finished the Bob. I thought I'd be like on volume 4 by now. The handwriting is very small in my defense, so I write them down very in tiny little print. But I'm only halfway through, which I guess makes sense since I'm probably roughly halfway through. A quarter of the way through my life. Yeah. So there's lots of space in it to go.
It seems like a very private thing. You write in the book about just a couple of times where you've shared it with other people, mm-hmm. right? What does it feel like writing about it publicly now?
Well, so you will note that in the book there's only one image from Bob. I've carefully put up a few other pages sort of on social media. But yeah, no, it'd be incredibly embarrassing to have someone actually go through the entire thing, because of course you read it, and I should say, I don't write about the books in there. It's just the title and the author and where I was when I read it sometimes, and occasionally a date. I spent a lot of my 20s living abroad, so a lot of that is sort of about the place where I was, but there isn't anything but the title. So on the one hand, that reveals nothing, but on the other hand, that reveals nothing, because like I could put down a bunch of books that I hated, and someone could pick up my Bob and be like, you read that? You know, like, why did you read that? And I'd be like, well, you know, I just wanted to know, well, like, why is it so popular? You know, you read for all different reasons. And that's kind of what I wanted to explore in my life with Bob. Like, you know, what do you glean from what you read? Like, why do you read what you read at a given moment in your life? Like, sometimes you read, again, like sort of out of stupid curiosity. Sometimes you read, like, on the very first page, which is in this book of books. I have Interview with the Vampire, which I really wanted to like. I hated it. I hated that book. And so that's one of the few books that has a little INC, a little ink next to it, which I wrote for books that were incomplete. But if somebody picks that up and looks at it and they were like, Anne Rice, really? You know, like so then they form some kind of impression of me that I don't know is necessarily revelatory in the way I would want it to be. So my life with Bob, this book, is quite personal, but in a weird way, it's not as personal as Bob itself.
Well, it's at least also written for an audience, whereas
Yes.
Bob's very much written for you.
Yes, yeah.
And this is much more personal than the books you've written before, which were much more reported and journalistic. Had you always sort of had it in your mind to write a memoir, or did it surprise you when that ended up being what came next?
Oh no, I was shocked. Even like when I signed the book deal, I didn't know it was a memoir until Publishers Weekly was like, Pamela Paul to write memoir, and I was like, oh my God, I'm writing a memoir? Like I thought it was like a book about books, and my editors, they had to kind of tame me a little bit from I kept trying to turn it into a travel book, essentially, and they were like, we don't need 3 chapters on Thailand. And so, the Brazil chapter's gone, and, there aren't 3 chapters. I had so much to say about, the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, but that didn't make it into the book. It is really personal, and it's funny, when I was writing it, I thought, well, I'll just write it the way, like, I need to write it, and it'll be really, really personal. And then when I'm all done, when it's totally done, before I hand it in, I'll just go back and I'll take everything personal out, I'll pretend like, let me pretend that like my child is reading this book and what would they think? And then anything that I thought would offend or upset them, I'll take it out. And then I just didn't do that. So now it's all out there.
Yeah, and it's one of the things, speaking of things that could feel embarrassing to put out into the world, which I don't think come across as embarrassing, but when you're writing it feel scary, is one of the things that I was really struck by in this book is when you write about your younger self, whether it's 10-year-old you inquiring about jobs at the library, sort of like sweet ideas that you had, or in your 20s, in your romantic life, in your teens, like various blunders or situations that you got yourself into. You write about all of that with a lot of compassion for your younger self. And I'm curious, was it hard to write about things that might have felt embarrassing or awkward? You already shared one strategy you use, which is pretend no one's going to read it. But I don't know, like, what's your relationship to sort of yourself, younger you as a character in the book?
So, I think that you don't want to sort of prettify your life, and you want to, I think, especially with memoir, you want to access that emotion in the moment and be honest about it. And for me, like the primary emotions of my life, and they still continue, are embarrassment, and embarrassment not only for me and my condition, but I have like contact embarrassment. So if someone else trips while walking down the street, I, on their behalf, will blush and feel like totally tortured for the rest of the afternoon. And guilt, pervasive guilt. Again, guilt not only for the things that I have committed, but guilt for everything that I may not have done, and yet other people may think I have done, and then guilt for everything that everyone else does. So those feelings were with me from childhood, and I write about reading this book that the comedian Sandra Bernhardt wrote called Confessions of a Pretty Lady. And she writes about like walking down the street picking her nose. And that stunned me as a child, because I was like, I walk down the street just trying to look like a normal person. And like the fact that you're like flagrantly violating the law, like by picking your nose, like it just was so shocking. And again, like I was able to easily access those feelings when I started to think about the books, because for me, because my childhood, I felt sort of so like different from everyone else, which everyone I know feels, or almost everyone, unless they're abnormal, unless they truly are different, in which case they feel like they're the same as everyone else, and that's what makes them so strange. But because I felt that way, I felt like books for me provided a kind of refuge and a place where I felt accepted. So that's what I wrote.
Yeah, it comes through. As I was reading, I was really surprised that this sort of, this kid who was so intensely concerned about all of those things and felt, I'm going like this, so I guess young you felt a little anxious to me, or just concerned about what was right and sort of staying on that path. And then in your teens and 20s, you traveled so much, and not easy travel either, not not just
to torture
France.
myself as much as possible.
And so first that was inspired by a book,
yes.
Right?
Yeah, so I was a good student. I went to an Ivy League college. I was going through the job recruitment process. My senior year, I had like a very clear path. I thought I was going to work for like some, I thought what I was going to do is I would either work in publishing or in advertising. But I basically, like any fancy corporation that came to campus to recruit, like I was on their, schedule. And I remember I was in an interview with Quaker Oats, and they were like, "Why do you want to work at Quaker Oats?" And I started to be like, I don't know what I said, but the part where I sort of gained consciousness of what I was saying was I was like, and I really like Quaker Oats Captain Crunch, but only with crunch berries. Like, I don't really like it when it doesn't have the crunch berries. And then suddenly I was like, what am I saying? Like, is this what I want to do with my life? And I just had this kind of experience where, you'd like see yourself from a bird's eye view and you're like, what are you talking about? And I just stopped talking and I was like, you know what? I don't want to work at Quaker Oats. And I walked out and I decided at that point that what I thought was maybe the options that I've been exposed to up to this point were like A through D, and I don't even know what E through Z are, and I therefore want to try to do something unlike anything that I've ever done. So I decided I would go to a country where I didn't speak the language, I didn't know anyone, I didn't have a job, I didn't have any friends, it was a different religion, I was an ethnic minority, and I picked out like a few countries that fit this, and also that I didn't have any interest in, and that I thought I might hate living in. Just to kind of really push myself to every possible extreme. And I came up with a list of countries, and then I narrowed it down. I also didn't want to live in a big international city because I'm from New York, and I thought, like, what's the point of just going to, like, Tokyo, and you can sort of do everything you could do in New York, pretty much. So I moved to Chiang Mai, which was a city of 100,000 people at that time, really like a town, basically, in northern Thailand. And this was before the internet. So, like, back then, moving somewhere like that was even more extreme in that I didn't have any contact with anyone. I didn't own a phone. I didn't have there was no mail delivery to where I lived, and my neighbor had a phone, and so every other week, and phone calls were super expensive, my parents would call me at a certain time, and I would talk to them. But the object of that travel was to constantly sort of put challenges in front of me and make it deliberately kind of difficult and unpleasant. And the book inspiration for that was a book called A Journey of One's Own, Independent Thoughts for the Independent Women's Traveler, I think is the subtitle, by Thalia Zapatos. And Thalia Zapatos was this woman who had, ridden camels through the deserts of Africa and had done all sorts of things that I thought, I would really hate doing that. And I thought, well, I guess I'll try that out. And it was one of those things where I felt like at the time, 5% of me made that decision to do that and dragged the other 95% along. And I just bought the, non-refundable ticket, and then it was too late to change my mind. Plus I told everyone on campus, and I called my parents, and then I was like, now it's just too embarrassing to be like, you know what, maybe I don't want to do something that hard. Maybe I just want to get a job in New York. But anyway, I did end up doing that, and it was probably the best decision I've ever made. One that I don't feel entirely responsible for, but nonetheless was the best thing.
Why was it so great? Was it as unpleasant as you thought it would be?
No, it was fantastic. No, it was really fantastic. I mean, there were aspects of it that were hard, and again, that was partly of my own doing. I decided at a certain point that I would go to China for 6 weeks on a budget of $15 a day, and this was in 1994. And so that budget, which was ludicrous, but I just set the budget. I didn't really have extra money, although I suppose I could have begged, stolen, or borrowed, but that's what I had. And so there were times when I was so strict about the budget that I was like, no, I cannot take the bed with the blanket, I shall sleep on the concrete block, but even that was it was such a, I was sort of trying to see what that would do to me as a person. I kind of felt like up until that point I'd had it too easy, and that I needed to, I don't know, sort of mess with myself a little bit. But even though in the day-to-day some of that was difficult, ultimately it was incredibly satisfying, and it taught me something that has stayed with me throughout my life, which is that up until that point, I'd had this really kind of foolish idea that life was like a path, and that I had every sort of task and accomplishment that I could do, I did, and I checked off my list, and I got to the Ivy League college, and then I could have gotten the job, and then I was like, and then you get the job, and then you get the promotion, and then you get the boyfriend, and then you're engaged, and I thought that that's what it was, and I thought that by getting off that path, that when I got back from living abroad, that everyone else would be like a few notches ahead of me, and I would have to spend the rest of my life catching up. And so it was revelatory to me at the time that no, within a year, we were all basically in the same place, just doing different things. And that enabled me a little bit later in my career to also make some abrupt changes. At one point I got up, I quit a brand new job that I had at Time Inc. that was like a big fancy job after 3 months to move to London, kind of on an impulse. And then later on, after working in media companies on the business side, it sort of enabled me to have the courage to quit my job to become a full-time writer. And I don't think that I would have been able to do those things had I not had that experience.
When you were in those other countries living that challenging life, what did that do to your reading tastes? Did you want to read comfort reading, or were you reading books about the places that you were traveling to?
It depended. When I was in Thailand, when I first got there, I basically clung to English literature, which is like my comfort literature. It's like Thomas Hardy. I wanted to read about comforting farmland and families in drawing rooms and that sort of thing. And that was my way to it was like a mooring for me. And then later on, when I was traveling in Vietnam and Cambodia, I did read a lot about those places, because the reason I had chosen to go to Thailand was because I truly had no interest in it at all. All I knew about Asia was Benihana restaurant, don't like it, and that Michael Crichton book, Rising Sun or whatever. That was it. That was my knowledge of all of Asia. So I did a lot of reading about it when I was there, because I wanted to, know what I was seeing. So before I went to Vietnam, I read a lot of war literature. Before I went to Cambodia, I read a lot about the genocide, and a lot of the history of those countries. So it was an education, certainly.
So you were saying that, your career has taken a sort of nonlinear path, and you were working in media, and then you started doing some freelance writing, and you left to be a full-time freelance writer for a while, mm-hmm. right? Was it straight from there to the Times Book Review?
Yes. So what happened was I had worked on the business side in a number of media companies, in documentary film and in television and publishing, and in magazines, and I quit those jobs to write my first book. I had started freelance writing on the side for The Economist. I wrote a weekly column on arts, and I loved doing that, and I did that at night. And that was my fun time, and I felt I sort of went to work and sort of put in my, paid my dues during the day and did what I loved at night. And it was almost I thought it would be too good to be true, to actually just be writing all day. But when I got my first book deal and I did quit the job to write all day, it was so amazing. It was truly what I wanted to be doing with my life. And I had always wanted to do, but had suppressed it because it was that would be too good, and I decided that I would never go back to working, to doing anything other than kind of being immersed in words. And so I freelanced for a long time for The Economist, and then I was writing primarily for Time. A couple of books that I wrote came out of stories that I did for Time during those years. And then I started freelancing for the Times for various areas, various sections of the paper. The paper, that's like a verboten word now, for the news organization. And I started freelancing for those. And then the editor of the book review was looking for a children's books editor. It was a full-time job. And he knew I didn't want to get a full-time job. I basically never wanted to work in an office again. And I liked being in my pajamas all day writing. So he asked me for help finding a children's books editor, because it's a great job. At that point, there'd only been 5 children's books editors in the history of the New York Times. And I was like, well, obviously I don't want it. And he's like, I know you don't want it, but help me find someone. And I did try to help him, but eventually I sort of thought, like, none of these people would do as good a job as I would, which I realize is incredibly obnoxious. But I really love children's books, and I believe in them passionately. And though I hadn't worked in them for a long time, I kind of thought that I could do a good job if maybe they could make the job part-time. So on a whim, I emailed him and I was like, well, maybe if you made this thing part-time. And within a month, I was sitting in the New York Times doing that job. So I basically Dick Cheney'd my way into the position because I was supposed to find someone else. And that's how I ended up there, and then became the features editor and, and then the editor.
So, first, you spend your days editing book reviews and you write books. Is it hard switching between the critical and the creative mindset?
That's a very good question. It's kind of, I don't know, I wonder if you were a handyman, you'd be like, well, now I'm going to fix the bathtub and then I'll work on the painting the walls and patching it. It's they're within the same family, but different skills. And I kind of like doing multiple things. So to me, it feels like a little bit of a palate cleanser. Like you're, and writing, I should say, is something that I don't generally do too much of in my day job. I wrote this book on the train, and I felt like it was like my treat at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day to dive deeply into reading, albeit only for 38 minutes, which was, it could have been longer. Like the one person that wanted a longer commute so that I could, finish a chapter or at least a page. But they are different skills. And I felt, when I was a freelancer too, that switching between magazine writing and newspaper writing and book writing was similar. Sometimes you think of it like the most negative way to think about it, but it's actually a good thing, is that when you get sick of all the things that bother you about writing magazine articles or whatever, you can go into the book, and then you get incredibly annoyed with certain things about books, so then you get to switch back to magazines and newspapers. So I feel like I get to do a little bit of it all, and it works out.
Yeah. I know there are some writers who don't read reviews of their own work. Do you read your reviews?
Yes, I read them and I dissect them, and I find every negative, thing. Yes, I read my reviews. And there's a third category of authors or people who just don't believe anyone who says that they don't read their reviews. So I have had people very adamantly tell me that they don't read their reviews, and then get very angry at me for the reviews that we've run in the book reviews.
Interesting. Question over here?
Sure. I've just started keeping a book diary myself, having obviously read for a long time, but I enjoy having the opportunity to have them written down. I find my memory is selective at times, where people ask me, or I might ask myself, what did I read last month? And I have no idea. No idea what I read last month until I see it on the page, and then I remember everything about that book. So I think I agree with you. Just the act of title author. I don't need to write a review because I remember it. That's enough for me. But I'm also, at this point in life, becoming more courageous in not completing books. How do you feel about that? I mean, you mentioned it with Anne Rice. Also a book that I wanted to love, Interview with a Vampire, and found it incredibly mediocre.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't believe quite as religiously as I once did about finishing every book that I start. Sometimes, because for me, books are the decision about what to read next is very much has to do with my mood at the moment. It's like movies, where you're like, I'm not in the mood for a thriller. I want something. But so I feel that way about books. I in a given moment, I want to read something that fulfills some kind of need, emotional need. And so sometimes I'll start a book and it's not necessarily that I don't like the book, but I find this isn't what I need right now, and so I'll put it down for a later time. I think one of the benefits of having sort of been in this world for so long is that I have a pretty good idea of what I want to read, so I don't have as many false starts as I did when I was a total idiot ignoramus working in Barnes B. Dalton when I was 17. I'm pretty strategic about what I read. So but I also, and I wrote an essay about this on the op-ed page of the New York Times a few weeks ago. I believe strongly in reading things that sometimes that I don't like, that I disagree with, that I find possibly even offensive, just to sort of get myself into a different mindset for a while. And again, it goes back to that sort of like weird tendency I have to challenge myself, or to like almost put myself in a kind of situation of discomfort on purpose. So I will sometimes finish books even if I really hate them, just to kind of get an understanding of like what it is that is bothering me so much.
Thank you. I agree.
It sounds like, you're, following your heart and your interest in what you read. Do you not have to do a ton of reading for your job? I'm surprised that you get to decide what you read, instead of like, here are the 10 new books coming out in the next few months that I have to read.
I should pretend that I do read all of that, but the dark secret is that I don't necessarily read everything that we cover. I am very good at reading around things, and I do get involved. There are a lot of books that I do read that have to do with my work life, and especially at the end of the year when we pick out our 100 notable books of the year and our 10 best books of the year. That's a collaborative process that I'm involved in, and you have to read those books in order to weigh in. But I'm pretty selfish as a reader. I really, like, this is the thing that I do. I don't go to concerts, and I like barely watch TV. I actually feel like I should be watching more TV because it's so good. So this is my pleasure, and I guard it a bit jealously.
One thing you say in the book is people have limited time for books, and the job of reviews is to help them make choices. And that's in the context in the book of dealing with having to write or edit negative reviews, and loving books and wanting to be positive, but also wanting to, help people make choices. So I guess my first question is, do reviews help guide your reading choices too?
They do, but sometimes, a negative review can make me want to read the book. Sometimes I read a negative review and I think about the reviewer, and that reviewer's voice is coming through, and I'm like, you're a jerk. And I don't like your opinion, and I'm going to read that book that you say is so terrible because I think I'm going to like it because I don't like you. So, I don't think, I think a negative review isn't always a bad thing. And, again, like at the Times, we're journalists, and we are trying to sort of guide and illuminate the world of books for our readers, and that doesn't, so we're not promoters of books, although of course we all believe in that. We wouldn't be working at the book review if we weren't fans of the format. And the other thing that I should say is that a lot of negative reviews come in from our critics, who many of them are freelance, and we don't share their opinions necessarily as the editors. Sometimes we'll send out a book, we love it. The review will come back and it's negative, but we are, again, it's a newspaper, a journal. Well, we are journalists, and what we do is we don't edit opinion. We're not going to change their mind. So we run those negative reviews, and then everyone gets angry at us.
And you're sitting there silently saying, I know, me too.
Yes, the hardest is when we have negative reviews of books by my colleagues, which does happen, and then we are sort of like department non grata at the New York Times.
Ooh, that must be tough.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like the equivalent here at another company, but I mean, it's to get a negative review in public. Like, I don't think people often think about what that feels like to be on the receiving end. Like, imagine you're a software engineer and, a colleague writes up a thing and is like, you know what, first of all, I see the way that guy manages his time. He was on Facebook for like 45 minutes. He was blah, 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 blah. And then they post it publicly for everyone to read. And that's what it is like getting a negative review. One of the advantages I feel like I have at the book review is that I have gotten negative reviews and I've given negative reviews. So I feel like I know what it feels like on all different sides. when I write a negative review, having gotten what I think are horribly unfair, unkind, and not true negative reviews myself, I try to be respectful of the fact that a book takes a lot of time to write and is often sort of dear to the heart of the writer, and to point out what the writer did well, as well as what the book got wrong, and not to attack the writer, but to really critique the book and to keep that separately. And there are a lot of things that you can do in a negative book review that are unfair. Like, you can use a book to advance an argument that you've already have set in your mind. You can go into a book not as an open reader, but with your own argument, and then read it in such a way that you're sort of cherry picking things out to support your point of view, and then write a book review that is essentially more of an op-ed. And those kind of things I think are incredibly unfair. So I try not to run them. And when we get those kind of reviews in, even if we can only edit them to a limited extent, those writers usually are not invited back to review.
Yeah. We have another question over here.
Hi, yeah, this is to kind of go back to what I think we were talking about like right at the beginning, but I love the idea of like tiny Pamela Paul at the library asking for a job. That is like so darling, and I love that kind of precociousness that a lot of kids have. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I work with Jaime on the books team. We have a whole editorial program here. I think we've all worked at bookstores. A lot of us have studied, literature, philosophy, have at one time wanted to be a librarian or like obscure French philosopher, like professor or something like that. So I guess I wonder, I think, when you and your colleagues on, the Inside the New York Times Book Review, and you talk about you talked about Victor Hugo forever when you were reading that.
Yes, forever being the key word.
Because
it took a long time.
Or your colleague who just finished, the Power Broker. You can tell you guys all probably have a similar childhood story of being kind of inexplicably drawn to books and to reading. And so I don't really know, the question is kind of like a absurd, existential question, but what do you think that's about? What did draw you to want a job at the library when you were a kid? And I guess that's it.
It's funny when you describe that, I think of that old movie Freaks, and there's that horrible scene at the end of Freaks where all the freaks are around a table and they're going, one of us, and that's the dorks of the New York Times Book Review, where it's I am among my people. One thing that we have in common when you sort of grew up reading more than you did talking, and you weren't well socialized, is that you mispronounce things. So before we go on the podcast, we're often wait a minute, how do you say that? We all mispronounce things all the time. But I think we all feel, incredibly lucky to be there. There are 3 colleagues that I have at the Book Review who've been there for more than 30 years, because it's the kind of thing if this is what you like to do, this is where you want to be. And unfortunately, we're the last freestanding book review in the country. The Washington Post folded Book World into Outlook in 2008, and the one before that was the San Francisco Chronicle, which folded in 2005. So I think we all feel we've gotten to where we need to be. In terms of what it is that makes people end up in a place like this doing this kind of work, I do think that one of the things that marks my colleagues, but again, I think it's true of many readers, is that reading for us is not purely intellectual. It's an emotional experience as well. And the thing that you can't see on that podcast is that people tear up, and people are people that we all feel very, very strongly about what we read and what we do. I don't know what it says about us as people, but there you have it.
Yeah. So I guess my last question is, what have you read lately that you've loved? So I'm trying to, I don't have my book of books in front of me. I don't have my cheat sheet. I don't remember things either. That's why I have my Bob too. It's my aide-memoire. So
I am almost done with Ben Bradley's memoir from 1995, which is called A Good Life, Newspapering and Other Adventures. And that's a book that I've been meaning to read since it came out. And I'm like, oh, I guess I'll get to that. I didn't realize like I'd been meaning to read it for 22 years. But there are many books that I have been intending to read for that long. And I love that. I'm a big fan of biography. And a novel that I read recently that's pretty contemporary that I adored was by a writer named Chris Batchelder called The Throwback Special. And this was an instance of reading something that I kind of thought I wasn't going to like. In fact, it's a novel about football. And as it becomes clearer, despite a brief period of playing rugby in college, I'm like the least sporty person. I mean, I will probably trip on my way off the stage. So I would never have read this book, but what happened is that one of my colleagues reviewed it and wrote such an entertaining, positive review that I really felt annoyed because I thought, like, now I'm tempted to read this, and I don't want to read a book about football. Like, I don't know a single thing about football, let alone care to know a single thing about football. So that happened, and then the paperback came in, and then I had like a little blurb from the reviewer who was on staff at the book review on the front cover, and I thought, like, darn it, like another thing that's going to make me want to read this book. And then I had to interview the author at an event up at Amherst College for the National Book Foundation, and so I thought, well, I got to read it now. And I loved it. It's really great. It's so funny. And of course, even though it is about football, it's about the Theismann play for those football people out there, which is apparently this like horrific injury that occurred on Monday Night Football like decades ago that the football people remember very well because the guy's leg broke in a really unkind way, and he never played football again. And the novel is about 22 guys who get together every year to recreate this play. And so it's sort of like a Civil War reenactment kind of thing. It meets like a guy's sort of ritual thing. But ultimately what the book is about midlife and manhood and masculinity and friendship. And I'm getting goosebumps. See, it's like we're very sentimental. And I loved it. It was really great, and it was so well written, and it was so funny. And so I was one of those annoying people that, like, anytime someone came into the room, I'm like, I'm just going to read this one paragraph, and then it would be like 2 pages. I'm like, I'm only going to read you just like one other thing that you just have to hear because it was that good.
All right, the Throwback Special?
Yes, I recommend
Good to
it.
know. All right, well, we're out of time now, but thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.